Beyond Voices presents Part 2, Chapter 1. It was the middle of the morning, and Winston had left his cubicle to go to the lavatory. A solitary figure was coming toward him from the other end of the long, brightly lit corridor. It was the girl with dark hair. 4 days had passed since he had run into her outside the junk shop. As she approached, he noticed her right arm was in a sling, blending with the color of her overalls. She must have injured her hand while using one of the big kaleidoscopes used for drafting novel plots. This type of accident was common in the fiction department. They were about 4 meters apart when the girl stumbled and nearly fell flat on her face. A sharp cry of pain escaped her, indicating she must have fallen on her injured arm. Winston stopped. The girl got up to her knees. Her face had turned a milky yellow color, with her mouth looking redder than ever. Her eyes locked onto his, showing an expression that seemed more like fear than pain. A strange feeling stirred in Winston's heart. In front of him stood an enemy who wanted to kill him, yet also a person in pain with possibly a broken bone. He instinctively started to help her. When he saw her fall onto the bandaged arm, it felt as if the pain was in his own body. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "It's nothing. My arm, it'll be fine in a second." She spoke as if her heart were racing. She had definitely turned very pale. "You haven't broken anything." "No, I'm fine. It hurt for a moment, that's all." She reached out her free hand, and he helped her up. She had regained some color and looked much better. "It's nothing," she said quickly. "I just banged my wrist a bit." "Thanks, comrade." She walked on, as briskly as if it had truly been nothing. The whole incident couldn't have taken more than half a minute. Not showing emotions on one's face was a habit that had become instinctive. In any case, they had stood right in front of a telescreen when it happened. Still, it was hard not to show a moment of surprise. In the 2 or 3 seconds while he was helping her up, the girl slipped something into his hand. There was no doubt that she had done it on purpose. It was small and flat. As he passed through the lavatory door, he placed it in his pocket and felt it with his fingertips. It was a piece of paper folded into a square. While standing at the urinal, he managed to unfold it with some difficulty. It was obvious there had to be a message written on it. For a moment, he considered going into one of the water closets to read it immediately. But that would be an act of foolishness, as he knew well. There was no place more certain to be watched by the telescreens. He returned to his cubicle, sat down, and casually tossed the piece of paper among the other papers on his desk. He put on his spectacles and moved the speakwrite toward him. 5 minutes, he reminded himself, at the very least. His heart pounded loudly in his chest. Fortunately, the task he was working on was routine. A long list of figures that didn't require much attention. Whatever was written on the paper had to have some political meaning. So far as he could tell, there were 2 possibilities. One, much more likely, was that the girl was an agent of the Thought Police, just as he had feared. He didn't understand why the Thought Police would choose to send messages this way. But perhaps they had their reasons. The note could be a threat, a summons, an order to commit suicide, or some other trap. But another, wilder possibility kept surfacing, even though he tried to push it away. It was the idea that the message didn't come from the Thought Police at all, but from some kind of underground organization. Perhaps the Brotherhood really existed. Maybe the girl was part of it. The thought seemed ridiculous, but it popped into his head the moment he felt the scrap of paper in his hand. The more likely explanation occurred to him only a few minutes later. Even now, though he reasoned that the message probably meant death, that was not what he truly believed. The irrational hope persisted. His heart raced, and he struggled to keep his voice steady as he murmured his figures into the speakwrite. He rolled up the completed bundle of work and slid it into the pneumatic tube. 8 minutes had passed. He adjusted his spectacles on his nose, sighed, and drew the next batch of work toward him. Placing the scrap of paper on top, he flattened it out. Written on it in a large, uneven handwriting were the words, "I love you." For several seconds, he was too stunned to throw the incriminating note into the memory hole. When he finally did, even knowing the danger of showing too much interest, he couldn't resist reading it again to make sure the words were real. The rest of the morning was a struggle to work. The worst part was trying to concentrate on a series of minor tasks while hiding his agitation from the telescreen. It felt like a fire was burning in his belly. Lunch in the hot, crowded, noisy canteen was torture. He had hoped to be alone for a while, but unfortunately, the irritating Parsons plopped down next to him, the smell of his sweat almost overpowering the tinny aroma of stew. He rambled on about preparations for Hate Week, particularly excited about a papier-mâché model of Big Brother's head, 2 meters wide, being made by his daughter's troop of spies. The annoying part was that with all the noise, Winston could barely hear what Parsons was saying and had to keep asking him to repeat himself. Once he caught a glimpse of the girl sitting at the far end of the room with 2 other girls. She seemed not to notice him, and he didn't look in that direction again. The afternoon was easier to handle. Right after lunch, he received a delicate and complicated piece of work that would take several hours and required putting everything else aside. It involved falsifying production reports from 2 years ago to discredit a prominent member of the inner party, who was currently under scrutiny. This was the kind of task Winston excelled at, and for more than 2 hours, he managed to put the girl out of his mind completely. Then her image returned, coupled with an intense, unbearable desire to be alone. It was impossible to think through this new development until he had some privacy. That evening, he had an activity at the community center. He quickly ate another bland meal in the canteen, rushed to the center, participated in a pointless discussion group, played 2 games of table tennis, downed several glasses of gin, and sat through a half-hour lecture called Ingsoc and Chess. He felt utterly bored, but for once he didn't mind his time at the center. The words "I love you" reignited his will to live. Suddenly, small risks seemed foolish. It wasn't until 11 p.m., when he was at home in bed, in the darkness where he could be safe from the telescreen as long as he remained quiet, that he could think freely. He needed to find a way to contact the girl and arrange a meeting. He no longer considered the possibility that she might be setting a trap for him. He knew that wasn't the case due to her clear anxiety when she slipped him the note. She had been terrified, as anyone would be. The idea of rejecting her advances didn't enter his mind. Just 5 nights ago, he had thought about smashing her skull with a cobblestone, but that didn't matter now. He pictured her naked, youthful body, just as he had seen it in his dream. He had imagined her to be foolish like the rest of them, her mind filled with lies and hatred, her belly cold. A feverish worry overtook him at the thought of losing her, of that innocent, youthful body slipping away from him. What he feared most was that she would change her mind if he didn't reach out to her soon. But arranging a meeting was a huge challenge. It felt like trying to move in chess when he was already mated. No matter where he turned, the telescreen was watching. All the possible ways to communicate with her had crossed his mind within 5 minutes of reading the note. But now, with time to reflect, he reviewed them one by one as if laying out instruments on a table. Clearly, the kind of encounter that had taken place that morning couldn't be repeated. If she had worked in the records department, it might have been simpler, but he barely had a clue where the fiction department was located, nor did he have a reason to go there. If he knew where she lived and when she left work, he could have arranged to meet her on her way home. But trying to follow her home wasn't safe, since it would mean lingering outside the ministry, which would attract attention. Sending a letter through the mail was out of the question. All letters were routinely opened during transit. In fact, few people wrote letters. For the messages that needed sending, there were printed postcards with long lists of phrases, and you would strike out the ones that didn't apply. In any case, he didn't know the girl's name or address. Eventually, he decided the canteen was the safest place to try. If he could spot her alone at a table, maybe in the middle of the room, not too close to the telescreens, and surrounded by enough noise, if those conditions lasted for, say, 30 seconds, he might be able to exchange a few words. For a week after this, life felt like a restless dream. The next day, she didn't show up in the canteen until he was leaving, just as the whistle blew. She must have been switched to a later shift. They passed each other without a glance. The day after that, she was in the canteen at the usual time, but she sat with 3 other girls, directly under a telescreen. Then for 3 terrible days she didn't appear at all. His mind and body felt unbearably sensitive, as if he were transparent. Every sound, every movement, every word he spoke or heard felt like torture. Even in sleep he couldn't escape her image. He didn't touch the diary during those days. If he found any relief, it was in his work, where he sometimes managed to forget himself for 10 minutes. He had no idea what had happened to her. He couldn't ask anyone. She might have vanished, committed suicide, or been transferred to the other side of Oceania. Worst of all, she might have simply decided to avoid him. The next day she returned. Her arm was out of the sling, and she had a band of plaster around her wrist. He felt such relief at seeing her that he couldn't help but stare directly at her for several seconds. The following day he almost spoke to her. When he entered the canteen, she was alone at a table away from the wall. It was early, and not many people were there. The queue moved forward, getting closer to the counter, then stopped for 2 minutes because someone was complaining about not receiving their tablet of saccharine. But she was still alone when Winston grabbed his tray and headed toward her. He walked casually, pretending to search for a spot at another table beyond her. She was about 3 meters away. Just a couple more seconds, and he would be there. Then a voice behind him called, "Smith." He acted like he didn't hear. "Smith," the voice repeated louder. It was no use. He turned around. A young man named Wilshire, with a silly face and blonde hair, smiled and invited him to a vacant seat at his table. It wasn't safe to refuse. Now that he'd been seen, he couldn't sit at a table with an unattended girl. That would draw too much attention. He sat down, forcing a friendly smile. The silly blonde face beamed back at him, and Winston pictured himself smashing a pickaxe right into it. A few minutes later, the girl's table filled up. She must have seen him approaching, and maybe she would take the hint. The next day, he made sure to arrive early. Sure enough, she sat at a table in nearly the same spot, alone again. The person before him in the queue was a small, quick man with a flat face and tiny, suspicious eyes. When Winston turned away from the counter with his tray, he saw that the little man was headed directly for the girl's table. His hopes sank. There was an empty spot at another table, but something about the little man suggested he would pick the most empty table for his comfort. With dread in his heart, Winston followed him. He had to get to the girl alone. Then there was a loud crash. The little man fell on all fours. His tray flew everywhere, and soup and coffee streamed across the floor. He quickly stood up, glaring at Winston, who he clearly suspected of tripping him. But it worked out. 5 seconds later, with his heart pounding, Winston was sitting at the girl's table. He didn't look at her. Instead, he unpacked his tray and started eating. It was crucial to speak right away before anyone else arrived. But now he was gripped by terrible fear. A week had passed since she first approached him. She must have changed her mind. It was impossible for this to end well. Things like this didn't happen in real life. He might have hesitated to speak if he hadn't seen Ampleforth, the hairy-eared poet, wandering around the room looking for a place to sit. Ampleforth vaguely liked Winston and would surely sit down at his table if he spotted him. There was maybe a minute to act. Both Winston and the girl continued eating steadily. Their meal was a thin stew of haricot beans. In a low murmur, Winston began to speak. They didn't look up and continued to spoon the watery food into their mouths, exchanging a few necessary words in quiet, expressionless tones. "What time do you leave work?" 18:30. "Where can we meet?" "Victory Square, near the monument. It's full of telescreens. It doesn't matter if there's a crowd." "Any signal?" "No, don't approach me until you see me among many people. And don't look at me, just stay near me." "What time?" 19 hours. "All right." Ampleforth didn't see Winston and sat down at another table. They didn't speak again, and, as much as possible for 2 people at opposite sides of the same table, they avoided looking at each other. The girl finished her lunch quickly and left, while Winston stayed behind to smoke a cigarette. He was in Victory Square before the meeting time. He wandered around the base of the large column topped by Big Brother's statue, looking south toward the skies, where he had defeated the Eurasian plains. It had been the East Asian plains a few years before in the Battle of Airstrip 1. In front of it stood a statue of a man on horseback, meant to represent Oliver Cromwell. 5 minutes past the hour, the girl still hadn't shown up. Again, dread gripped Winston. She wasn't coming. She had changed her mind. He slowly walked to the north side of the square and found some small pleasure in identifying St. Martin's Church, whose bells, when they rang, had chimed, "You owe me 3 farthings." Then he spotted the girl at the base of the monument, reading or pretending to read a poster spiraling up the column. It wasn't safe to approach her until more people gathered. Telescreens surrounded the pedestal. At that moment, shouting and the sound of heavy vehicles came from the left. Suddenly, everyone began running across the square. The girl quickly darted around the lions at the base of the monument to join the rush. Winston followed. As he ran, he heard shouted remarks indicating that a convoy of Eurasian prisoners was passing through. Already a dense crowd filled the south side of the square. Normally, Winston would stay on the outskirts of such a commotion, but he pushed, shoved, and squirmed his way to the center. Soon he was within arm's length of the girl, but he was blocked by an enormous prole and an equally large woman, presumably his wife, creating an impenetrable wall. Winston squeezed sideways and, after a violent lunge, managed to force his way through. For a moment, it felt like his insides were being crushed between their muscular bodies. Then he broke through, slightly out of breath. He was beside the girl. They stood shoulder to shoulder, both staring straight ahead. A long line of trucks, with guards armed with submachine guns standing at each corner, crept slowly down the road. Inside the trucks, little yellow men in shabby greenish uniforms sat tightly together. Their sad, Mongolian faces looked out over the sides of the trucks, completely uninterested. Occasionally, when a truck jolted, there was a clank of metal. All the prisoners wore leg irons. Truck after truck of those sorrowful faces passed them. Winston knew they were there, but he could only catch fleeting glances at them. The girl's shoulder and her arm down to her elbow pressed against him. Her cheek was almost close enough for him to feel its warmth. She took charge of the moment, just as she had in the canteen. She began speaking in the same unemotional tone as before, with barely moving lips, her voice a mere murmur drowned out by the noise around them and the rumble of the trucks. "Can you hear me?" "Yes." "Can you get Sunday afternoon off?" "Yes." "Then listen carefully. You need to remember this. Go to Paddington Station." With surprising precision, she laid out the route he should take. A half-hour train ride, then turn left outside the station. 2 kilometers along the road, a gate missing its top bar, a path across a field, a grassy lane, a track between bushes, a dead tree covered in moss. It was as if she had a map in her head. "Can you remember all that?" she murmured. "Yes." "You turn left, then right, then left again. And the gate has no top bar." "What time?" "About 3. You may have to wait." "I'll arrive another way." "Are you sure you remember everything?" "Yes." "Then get away from me as quickly as you can." She didn't have to tell him that. But at that moment, they couldn't separate from the crowd. The trucks continued to roll by, and people still gawked. At first, a few boos and hisses erupted from party members in the crowd, but that soon stopped. The dominant feeling was curiosity. Foreigners, whether from Eurasia or East Asia, seemed like strange creatures. You rarely saw them except as prisoners, and even then, you couldn't really observe them for long. You never knew what happened to them. The few who were hanged as war criminals were the only ones you heard about. The rest just vanished, likely into labor camps. The round Mongol faces gave way to faces of more European appearance, dirty and exhausted with beards. From their scraggly cheekbones, eyes looked into Winston's with strange intensity before darting away again. The convoy was finishing up. In the last truck, he noticed an old man with a face full of grey hair, standing with his wrists crossed in front of him, as if he was accustomed to being bound. It was almost time for Winston and the girl to say goodbye, but at the last moment, while the crowd surrounded them, she reached for his hand and squeezed it briefly. It could not have lasted more than 10 seconds, yet it felt like a long time with their hands together. He took the time to notice every detail of her hand. He felt the long fingers, the shaped nails, the work-hardened palm with its calluses, and the smooth skin on her wrist. Just from the touch, he felt he would recognize it by sight. In that same instant, he realized he did not know the color of the girl's eyes. They were probably brown, but people with dark hair sometimes had blue eyes. Turning his head to look at her would have been unthinkable. With their hands locked together, hidden in the crowd, they stared straight ahead. Instead of looking into the girl's eyes, the aged prisoner's eyes peered mournfully at Winston from beneath his hair.
If you like our recordings, consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, so you don't miss any more audiobooks. And next part coming soon. Till then, take care, bye.